It's not showing.
Okay. That's right. Okay.
And maybe I can just
Yeah.
share this screen.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
It's on this. It's speaking.
It's pretty good.
It will announce that it starts in a couple of minutes. Maybe.
Yeah, well, just give it time. Just give us 2-3 minutes. And we will start in 2-3 minutes.
And I was on the third floor,
Yeah, well,
quietly waiting for the event to start. Not realizing I was in the wrong place. The advantage of back-to-back meetings. Well, welcome to this session on, not call that, but it's on Mission Impossible, or otherwise, towards evidence-based decision-making and climate policy impact estimations. So Derja and colleagues here allowed me to say a few words to get started. And actually, as I was explaining to the colleagues from Norway that I had a bilateral with, for somebody telling me I was in the wrong place, they're here now. They have worked a lot on policy approaches for Article 6 and other things. Therefore, they would like to do ITMO or carbon transaction based on policy approaches. What's the problem they have? It's very difficult to link direct outcomes to those policy approaches, right? That's the same thing we're facing here in GGI. Years ago, I asked our thematic teams on energy and landscapes and cities and so on to do more analytical work to recommend what kind of policies we should be working on. And they found that very hard. Actually, I think I can be honest enough to say that we have had lots of successes in GGI, but we haven't made as much progress as we would like to see in exactly that area. Ideally, to try and come up with ex-ante impact estimations of policies, or at least to have a clearer impact pathway to think through what the policy actions are and what their desired outcome is. A couple of years ago, we asked the COP leads, can we try and do that? And they came back with a document which in the end was mostly case studies of what we had done, not really indicating what the impact of that would be. So that's just a bit of background from saying, so what are we trying to do now? The goal is still the same, I think. In GGI, de facto, what our impact pathway is that we say we do policy work, and after that we do financial mobilization to implement those policies, and then we link the finance mobilization that we do to the strategic outcomes that follow. But it would be great if we were clearer on either how those policies do indeed or don't create the enabling conditions for those investments. And of course, some policies may very well have impacts in their own right. When you change a fuel standard, it probably should be possible to estimate what the impact of such a change would be, right? Okay, a relatively easy example. So I'm convinced that we can do more thinking, even though that is hard enough to call that somewhat jokingly Mission Impossible this year for GGI insiders. And Derja and colleagues have done, I think, a great job to hook up with Lillywith, who has a policy simulation tool that was always built around the idea that you could think through the impact of policy with your stakeholders, and also to create partnerships with others outside GGI, such as the OECD and World Bank and others, who are all struggling with the same area and probably have made more advances than we have. So well, they asked me to moderate, but I'm actually very curious to see what the presenters have to say and how we are potentially having an interesting discussion on advancing this topic, getting clearer thinking around, at the very least, the impact pathway, and hopefully moving towards forms of impact assessment, meaning with ex-ante and eventually ex-post. Good enough for getting started. I think the first contribution we're going to listen to is from Derja and Lillywith to introduce a little bit the work we've been doing in GGI. Can you get started?
yes, thank you so much, Frank, for welcoming. Yes, you are right. this work is more of to find evidence, especially checking what is the quantitative impact of our policies, not only our policies, how we could measure policies impact quantitatively to give a kind of, direction, evidence-based kind of decision as well. So you are right. So today, my speech will be more on the GGGI's project, which is more of we started this year. And I'll have some overview, what's going on, what's happening so far. And then the next step would be what kind of tool we used so far. And then we will share some preliminary findings through the work what we are working with our colleague here. So I will start first thing, why we need the policy evaluation or impact analysis, quantitative evaluation of the policy. When you see on slide 4, you could have, are you controlling? Okay, just give me the photo slide. Yes. So if you look at it, the slide here and the last, 1980 to 2020, a number of climate policies are coming in. Especially if you see in 2020, 2010, and 2015, huge number of policies are coming in. If you count all, based on the World Bank calculation, there is around 4,500 climate policies already existing on that. Which means, in addition to that, which means around 17 nationals already came up with net zero. However, we are not on track of at least reaching out, the limit of the Paris Agreement. Even some models also estimate that if with the current policies, it will be a challenge as well to reach our Paris Agreement going forward. So it is really important so that our policy should have impactful. There should be a policy impact that could really show us accountability and responsibility as well, the countries, when they are going forward implementation of this national determined contribution. Not only that one, in slide 5, if you go in 5, we have also checked some references on national determined contribution of countries. There is also a huge gap based on the target, what they pledged on, and then the implementation is lacking. Some of the countries are also mentioned as well here. So this shows it is really important. Where are our impactful policies? What should be done differently to bring the impactful policy for a change of the track where we are heading on, above the Paris Agreement. On the next slide, so why then we need to have policy impact assessment on policy impact assessment, which is really we are not reaching our goal, the global pledge. And then at the same time, we need to have evidence how and where to improve. At the same time, decision makers should be following and tracking on the implementation of the policy work, what is supported and adopted in the country. Saying that, this is really keen for effective and accountability of each country where they want to improve the target, where they want to share the quantitative information, not only the climate emission reduction, but at the same time, the socio-economic development of the country quantitatively to address. So we need to have this impact. Going to the next slide. So then, what is then GGGI initiated this year? What Frank mentioned, we have been supporting our member countries and policy support as well as technical assistance. But whereas we are not clear of, or somehow the policies what we supported is more of qualitative information rather than quantitatively. How much kind of emission reduction is coming, how much number of green employment is created, how much the service offering is increased, and how much of the air pollution is reduced on that. So saying those, we try to start first, to understand what we have to do, ex-ante analysis on the policies, what we already developed through stepwise approach for this year. The first thing is we have to understand exactly what are our policies, how we categorize those policies. Let's say the last 5-6 years, we have been supporting our countries a number of policy areas, strategies, regulatory framework, and NDC LDT layers as well. So we have to understand where are those policy. We created those policy and we create a kind of database on that. So going forward, the next step is, yes, we have to understand what is the existing literature or the existing science saying how is the methodology developed around the globe to quantitatively measure the policies. So we went through understanding on those as well to estimate what kind of method they have. And then the next step is, of course, we have to really see how we prioritize our policies on our database so that we have to prioritize which policies we have to first prioritize to go forward doing some quantitative analysis. Next slide. So the idea of our project, the Mission Impossible project, is not only creating a policy database, but also we have to really come up with a general framework, a methodology that could measure quantitatively towards our strategic outcomes, which our strategic outcomes are very much aligned with SDGs as well. So to say that, just to give you a little bit of overview about our policies for the last 2015 to 2023, we are increasing number of service offerings on the policy support, like, we reached around, 300 policies, but then you see every year we are around between, increasing higher. We're going high, which is a huge demand, huge kind of areas of interest from our member countries supporting and policy on climate actions. If you see regional as well, you see more, we have been supporting Asia countries. That's also, we have a number of member countries from Asia, most. That's how really shows exactly the demand on the policy support from our member countries are increasing. Next slide. This is also a little bit of to show you not only national policy support we do, also we have also subnational support in countries. So to give you a little bit of Indonesia, Colombia as well, from Latin America, Africa as well, we have been supporting a number of, national, subnational and, policy adoption across the regions as well. Next slide. So what we have done then is we have around 300 policies of supported and adopted policies in our member countries. So the first thing is we have to prioritize our policy according to the number of certain criteria. What is the criteria are how its effectiveness, relevance, feasibility, and cost and time implement. So as I said, our work is more of focusing on ex-ante analysis. So we have to understand those policies, what we have, based on different programmatic solutions as well. We have around 11 programmatic solutions, and these are some of the examples to mention. So PS2 is programmatic solution 2, which is climate action. We have a number of policies in those area. And then sustainable mobility, circular economy, and sustainable waste management, and green buildings as well. What we have done is we use AHP, hierarchy, analysis. And then, of course, you are supported by our community practice thematic leads to give us their understanding based on their experience in their programmatic solution as well. So we shortlisted from 300 policies to around 20 policies so that we could work on those policies, how they are impactful using the quantitative method, which we will talk about it, GGCM, the Green Growth Simulation Model. So next slide. So this is just to give you an overview, what are our strategic outcomes, how much it is aligned more with SDGs, because our target is to evaluate our policy impact toward these strategic outcomes, more to identify that framework which could really evaluate some of, or if possible, all of them, if not some of the strategic outcomes evaluation on those. So for this year, we are starting with SO1 and SO2 and SO3 slightly, because the first thing is really manageable for us as well. We have been working. And then adding as well the green employment, which is also something we are working on. And then the others are increased access to sustainable energy and sanitation as well we are working on. So this year, we have started with 3 SOs to consider, but next year we will continue developing the methodology which we are using, the simulation, which is GGC-SIM, so that we will capture all the evidence or the quantitative information to all strategic outcomes. Next slide. So saying that, so now we already prioritize our policies. Then the next step is what kind of tool we have, what kind of framework we would like to use. That's we identified through our internal colleague here, because we already developed a tool called GGC-SIM. That tool is going to be used for our analysis, and for that, I'll invite my colleague, Dr. Lilibet, to give us what is done, what is some of the preliminary findings we have already for some of the policy work we have. Over to you, Lilibet.
Thank you, Derek. So what you see here is we have already updated the strategic outcome guideline. That means we have actually methodologies for each of these SOs, right? So, but why are we applying GGC-SIM? I will tell you why. But first, I would like to highlight to you that in the previous years, we didn't have these additional outcome indicators. But we have added that now because these indicators are also representing SDGs. So we are trying to expand the coverage of the SO outcomes on SDG indicators. Next slide, please. So this just gives you a bit of background about the work we're doing, which actually Derija already explained to you. What I would like to highlight here is actually we have already what we call index and simulation tool website. And these two tools are interlinked. The champion of these tools are actually our DG, Frank, and I'm really happy to really have been supporting this work in the past years. Next slide, please. Now, let me go back to the very basic for you to understand what is the link between the index and the GGC. We're using the index to assess the performance of the countries in the green growth transition, particularly in achieving SDG targets from 2010 to the present. But many of the policies, particularly when you talk about LT-LED, SNAP, or NDCs, they look forward up to 2050. That means the index will not be able to do this. That's why we are linking the GGC. Next slide, please. So this is just showing you the different global green growth index reports that we have been publishing in the past years, but we are also publishing reports on the GGC in addition to this. Next slide, please. So as I said, the Green Growth Index measures performance in green growth transition from 20 to present. And the challenge is how do we assess the impacts of the intervention policies on the SDGs into the future, which is most relevant for the policymakers. This is the reason why we are linking the Green Growth Simulation tool to the index, where this simulation tool are representing the models for each of the SDGs. So you could imagine the SDGs having their own models. But then the innovation that we're doing in GGC-SIM is that we are interlinking these different models. So usually the policy interventions are getting into the efficient and sustainable resource use dimension of the Green Growth Index, and not very much into the natural capital protection, green economic opportunities, especially social inclusion. So I will get back to the social inclusion to you later, because this was the part of the index that was giving me lots of headaches in the past. So what this is giving you is that when you inject a policy in the energy, in the water, land use, waste, or material use, this will also give an impact on other SDG indicators of the index. Next slide, please. So this is actually what we have done in the LT-LEDs of Ethiopia, where we have applied the SDG co-benefits assessment of the SDGs. Next slide, please. So in addition to Ethiopia, we have also applied it to the LT-LEDs of Burkina Faso and Hungary, as well as to the NAPs of St. Lucia and Senegal. So the GGCM is giving us is that from 2020 to 2050, it will give you results on the SDGs based on the policy interventions for the different scenarios. Next slide, please. And this year we have also started updating the GGC models using energy optimization model in order to align our methodology to the IEA energy database that we have. So we are really trying to see that we are trying to make the resource more efficiently used. And what we are also doing a lot this year is we are including water, material, and waste circularity model. And next slide, please. You can see, because of these changes, we are able to cover lots of the SOs already in the GGCM. So it will be able to give the results for these SOs. Next slide, please. Now, talking about the headache that I was telling to you, because there are no good system dynamics models for social and gender SDGs. And there are also lots of data which are missing. So that's why we cannot link the SDG models into the other models for the water, energy, land use, or other systems. So what we have started doing in the last 2 years, we have already applied artificial intelligence. And I would like to invite you for the next session. You will get more information about this because I will dive into the models that we are using. So the idea here is actually by linking this AI model, AI approaches, we are not just using it to validate the very complex system dynamics models, but at the same time using AI to be able to get results for the SDG co-benefits for social inclusion and gender SDG indicators. And you can see the examples on the list on the right side. Next slide, please. And because of this, we are able, or we will soon able to cover all the SOs that we have in the guideline that we have. But on top of that, because you have seen there are lots of SDGs in the Green Growth Index, this will also be able to cover the additional indicators that we have for the SOs. So with this, I would like to hand over to Derek.
That's all from our end. Maybe we'll come back for Q&A session later.
Excellent. That was a very nice overview from Derek and Elizabeth. Waiting patiently, we can see you on the screen. The other good outcome of the work of Derek and MAPI from our side is that they created some partnerships with some other organizations interested in the same issues. And on the screen, you can see Daniel Nachtigal from OECD, Aaron Danford of Perspectives, and Francesco Tonini of the Politecnico Milan. Thank you for joining us. And I look forward to hearing from the three of you, your perspectives and interesting work that you're doing. Daniel, could we start with you and hand the floor to you?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me well?
Very well.
Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, you see the screen?
Yeah, yes, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so many thanks for the invitation, and I guess good afternoon to most of you. So let me really say it's very interesting to hear that, to listen to your presentation, because it really seems to be an extremely ambitious agenda, and I guess kind of the work streams that we are having at the OECD could potentially also feed into that agenda, or at least there are certainly some synergies. So what I want to talk about today is, I mean, essentially we know that the Paris Agreement requires large emission reductions and policymakers need to know what works. But we also see that there is actually a huge evaluation gap. I mean, in a way, like if you look at the empirical, so at the exposed literature, not the ex-ante literature, we see actually that most of these empirical exposed literature focuses on the effect of a very few headline policies, and that is actually mostly carbon pricing. But then at the same time, there are countless of other policies, in particular regulations or information instruments that are either sparsely evaluated or actually not at all. And the reason for that is that usually we don't have really coherent climate policy data for those instruments available. And what we are trying at the OECD is to really fill that gap. And what I want to show you is in that presentation is two things. I mean, first, how do we fill that gap with OECD climate policy data? And second, how that data can then also be used for impact evaluation. So let me start with the first thing with the OECD climate policy data. We have developed the Climate Actions and Policies Measurement Framework. It's an incredible long name with a very bad acronym. And that is in a way like a climate mitigation policy database. So the major purpose is twofold. I mean, one is really to be able to track government's climate action over time. And then the second purpose is also to enable analytical work. So in terms of geographical coverage, we have at the moment 50 countries, which is essentially OECD countries and G20 countries and OECD partner countries. We have mostly national level policies. We have also some selected subnational policies. We have the temporal coverage from 1990 to 2023. And in terms of policy coverage, it's essentially, so in total, we have 130 policy variables. We cover around 75% of instrument types that are listed in the latest IPCC report. And you will see in the next slide that is really like a very diverse set of instruments. So it's market-based instruments, it's non-market-based instruments. And we cover many of those also in 4 different sectors. So at the moment, only the energy sector, so transport, buildings, electricity, and industry. So what is the value added of that policy database? So the first one is really that it is a coherent climate policy data to the extent that we track exactly the same policy variables and policies across all countries and time. And that actually really allows you to compare apples and apples. You know, so if you go to other policy databases, usually there is not, you can of course do a policy count, but you need to be aware that that policy count is essentially driven by the input of the analysts and by the structure of the country. You know, I mean, we have been a lot of experience with a different policy database at the OECD, the PINE database. And what you can, for example, see that France, where we have a very active delegate, which has also like a completely different system of regulations, has something like 550 policies included, whereas Germany has only something like 45. You know, and it doesn't mean that, so it's very difficult to compare these two numbers. So our approach here is different. So we have the same policy scope for all countries, and we track that consistently across countries and across time. The second big value added is what you usually do not find in any other climate policy database is that we have information on policy stringency. And that is in particular important because what we actually see mostly in OECD countries is that they expanded their climate action not necessarily by adopting new policies, but by strengthening new ones. So if you look at the European Union climate flagship policy, the European Union Emission Trading Scheme, so if you would just look at policy adoption, you would essentially stop at 2005 when the EU ETS was implemented, and you would really miss kind of all the measures that were responsible that the price is now not 5 euros anymore, but somewhere in between 80 and 90 euros. So policy stringency is also one of the variables that we have. I don't want to spend too much time here. It's just like to give you like a very broad overview of the policies that we have. As I said, we have 4 different sectors. We have market-based instruments, non-market-based instruments, cross-sectoral policies, so also like some information on net zero targets, RD&D expenditure, some international policies. I would propose I can put the link to the working paper in the chat later on, so you can refer to that framework when you have some time. What I do want to do is to just show you like before I start to go into the impact evaluation, to just show you like a very few use cases that how we use the data. So as I said, one of the major purposes is indeed to track the government's climate action. And that chart that you see here was in a way like the key message of last year's Climate Action Monitor. So it shows the number of adopted policies and the stringency for all OECD and G20 countries. And what you can actually see is that between 2010 and 2021, we had like a continuous growth. So we had a number of adopted policies grew and stringency grew. But then in 2022, suddenly there was almost like a stop. So the growth really significantly declined. Then what we can also do is we can look into the different policy mixes of countries. So here it's just like it indicates like the share of non-market-based instruments on total climate action. And that is actually also quite interesting here, what you can see, because I mean, mostly Europe and, or let's say the early OECD countries, so they really have a huge emphasis on market-based instruments. Whereas kind of countries that joined the OECD later and G20 countries, so they have actually like their policy approach is more characterized by non-market-based instruments like regulations and information instruments. So countries really do have different policy approaches. Then that slide is kind of, that gives you like really zooming into one country and showing in a way what is the policy, what are the detailed policy of that country. And here we see, well, I actually don't even know. No, I think that's just like, I mean, that's just like a fictional example. But you can see, okay, so that country has like an emissions trading scheme in electricity and industry. It has a carbon tax in buildings and so on and so forth. And that is in a way, I mean, that data, and that links a little bit to what GGGI is trying to do. That links a little bit to our country teams. So, I mean, what we do is we submit that data to our country teams, and they can use that raw data, that policy raw data in their ex-ante assessments of policies. Yeah, so I mean, they have like their own energy models and CGE models. They use that raw data, put it into their models, and then they create the business as usual scenario with that. So then last slide on how it can be used. So we can also compare kind of, or have like a first indication of where more climate action might be needed. So here, a very precise example for Germany. We see climate action in the blue bar and the emissions share in the red dot. And we see actually for Germany that that there's still like a problem in the electricity sector. So we have by far the highest emissions share, but we have relatively low climate action. So that is kind of a very first indication for our country desk to say, okay, so look for that particular country here, Germany, maybe you should strengthen your climate action in the electricity sector. Okay, so here I stop in a way for how the CAPMF can be used for trends, and now how we use it for effectiveness analysis. So that work that I'm presenting now is in a way based on a study that was led by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and it was just recently published in Science. And it looks at the ex-post effectiveness of climate policies. So what you see here, I mean, it's an example of the UK electricity sector. It's a very complicated chart, but just kind of the key point here is that you see like the blue and the black line, which is the emissions, and you see kind of in UK's electricity sector in the middle of the 2010s, there are two major emissions breaks that has been identified. So in a way, like the study does the following. So in the first step, it also runs like a machine learning model to agnostically detect emissions break. Here in the UK electricity sector, we identify two. And that is actually also quite reassuring, because everybody who has worked on electricity knows that kind of the UK electricity sector is really like one of the best examples of a sector or a country sector that really managed to bring down emissions significantly. So then in the second step, we use our climate policy database. And we see which policies have been actually adopted or strengthened in that period of time where we see the emissions breaks. And what we see here, actually, it's quite interesting because it really reveals that it has been like a combination of instruments that are associated with that emissions break. And that is really something that is quite new to the literature, because the previous literature essentially almost exclusively associated that decline in emissions to carbon pricing, to the emissions trading scheme. But our study here really shows that these small, colorful squares that you see, that it has been, yes, carbon pricing, so the green square is part of the story, but there are actually also many more things going on. So there has been also like a ban and a phase out. There has been air pollution standards that has been strengthened, and so on, renewable portfolio standards that has been strengthened. So kind of a really complex mix of policy instruments that have been responsible for that. So we do that not only for the UK electricity sector, but we do that for all the 4 sectors that we have and for all the countries that we have. And in total, we are able to identify 63 emissions breaks. And then we summarize that information on the emissions break a little bit more. So what we essentially do is we simplify that information. So first we distinguish between developed economies and developing economies. And then we also aggregate the different policies into higher level policy categories. So for all those of you who are not so familiar with the Venn diagrams on the right-hand side, so here these 16.7% essentially means that among all developed or among all effective policy combinations in developed economies, 16.7% could be exclusively attributed to pricing. Or then to the subsidies, 33.3%, again, kind of among all emission breaks detected in developed economies, 33.3% could be attributed to a policy mix that consists of subsidies, regulations, and pricing. So you have like this overlap here. And that actually brings me to the key result slide of that study, which brings together kind of everything that we have analyzed for the 4 sectors. So for electricity, industry, buildings, and transport. So when the PIC colleagues and myself, when we saw the data first, it was kind of very difficult for us to make sense of it. Because there isn't really like a very clear pattern. I mean, just to give you one example, if you look at subsidies, for example, in the electricity sector, so they work well in conjunction with regulations and pricing in developed economies, but they're actually also working quite well as a standalone policies in developing economies. And similarly, I mean, you have completely different effectiveness in if you look at subsidies in the industry sector, for example. And that essentially is kind of the first and the key message of that paper. So there is no one size fits all. So we can really say like successful policies and policy mixes really vary across sectors and country groups. However, we can do like if we really dig into the data, then we see like a few patterns. So for example, if we compare like the upper panel, which is electricity and industry, with the lower panel, buildings and transport. So then we see actually in the upper panel, the policy mixes, they are less complex. You have some interactions, but you don't have too many interactions. And that is in a way not very surprising, because you have kind of profit maximizing firms in these sectors. That probably adhere more to an ECO 101 model. So you need less complementary policies for those. But then if you go down to buildings and transport, then you see actually that there are a lot of policy interactions. So you have really like very complex policy mixes that have been effective, which is again, or which could be explained by just in these sectors having really like high shares of private consumers, which may have like these behavioral biases that we know from the economics literature, which face financial constraints and so on and so forth. So that's the second message. Third one is, if we compare developed economies and developing economies, then we actually see that both country groups have actually very different policy needs. So in developed economies, we can actually say that usually all policy approaches seem to work well, so pricing, regulation, and subsidies. Whereas in developing economies, pricing does not always seem to work in developing economies. Yeah? So if you see, for example, in the electricity sector, also in the transport sector, pricing is not part of the story here. And then the last key message, if we look at the interactions, you see that there are actually quite a few interactions. And then here the message is really like policy mixes are actually more effective than standalone policies. So I mean, out of all the emission breaks that we have detected, 70% of those can be attributed to policy mixes, 30% only to standalone. Let me just finalize by showing you a little bit what we have in the pipeline on future work. So there's a policy scope. So we definitely want to go into extend the sectoral scope, so towards the AFOLU sector and the circular economy sector. We also want to extend the thematic scope, in particular climate adaptation. And then also we continue working on the instrument scope. And then the second point is the geographical scope. So we are at the moment in contact with our colleagues at the OECD who are working on Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And I'm also we are also in contact with DERECE for GGGI countries. And I mean, as I said, the moment that you have kind of these policy data that we have available, you could actually easily replicate essentially everything that I showed you in the first part of the presentation. And we are also thinking of replicating the science paper, so to convert it in a way into a living assessment tool that then gives you the opportunity to rerun that model once you have new policy data for new countries. So with that, let me close and happy to answer any question either now or later. Many thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. I thought that was very interesting, frankly. Very nice overview of your work. I think what we'll try and do is have the other presentations and then have some discussion with questions from here. So thank you very much. Can we turn to Aaron? Aaron, are you ready with your views? The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Give me a moment and I'll share my screen.
I can hear you.
Okay, you should be seeing my screen now. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Erin Danford. I'm a consultant with Perspectives Climate Research. If you're not familiar with Perspectives yet, we are an international research and consultancy firm with a particular focus on carbon markets. And today I'm here to talk about our Transformational Change Toolkit. So to give you some background, the topic of transformational change has become a bit of a buzzword recently. Of course, we always want to be influencing policies that lead to transformational change, but there's still a bit of a question of what does this actually mean? How do we operationalize it? And then how can we actually evaluate transformational change? So Perspectives worked together with UNEP CCC, Carbon Limits, and Climate SI to develop a toolkit to actually assess the transformational change potential of different types of policies, actions, and projects, including carbon market projects, covering both mitigation and adaptation. So the toolkit focuses on facilitating the application of the International Climate Action Transparency's transformational change methodology, which was developed. And we developed a free-to-use web-based software. So if you're interested in trying out the tool yourself, you can find the toolkit and a number of video tutorials at the link here, or you can also just scan the QR code. So we started this project, and of course, the big question that you have to answer before you get into anything is what actually is transformational change? There's a lack of a good definition of transformational change. So within the context of the toolkit, we define transformational change as a fundamental sustained change of a system that disrupts established unsustainable and carbon-intensive practices and/or leads to a sustained reduction in vulnerability, contributing to a zero carbon, climate resilient society in line with the Paris Agreement's goal to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C, the Global Goal on Adaptation, and the United Nations SDGs. Overall, the toolkit, as I said, is meant to operationalize and adapt the transformational change methodology to easily assess both mitigation and adaptation interventions. So this can be policies, individual projects, or other types of activities, and to be able to target a range of different users. We wanted to take this methodology that was developed and make it applicable to concrete cases, and then make it accessible to users through a user-friendly online platform. So in the end, we ended up developing 4 different tools, with each organization responsible for a different tool or set of tools. Perspectives worked on the carbon market tool, which is meant for project developers, carbon market developers, before or after implementation, and government officials who are considering authorization of carbon market projects. Then we also developed an investment tool that was done by Carbon Limits, which is meant for financial institutions and the private sector when considering making an investment. Then we have a general tool, which is probably the most applicable for policy crediting. And here, everyone but mainly government officials are thought of here to be able to assess the impact of policies, and also applicable for policy decision-making, I think, is the portfolio tool. And this is meant to assess a portfolio of different actions. So for example, a country could look at the portfolio of policies that have been implemented or are in the pipeline to potentially be implemented to be able to assess the transformational impact of these policies. So we have 4 tools, but what you would do when you first open the toolkit is first define your intervention. So we refer to an intervention as any project, policy, or even a set of activities. And the next thing you would do is choose one of 3 tools to assess this. So you have the carbon market tool, the investment tool, or the general tool. And once you've done an assessment using one of these tools, you receive a report which assesses the outcomes and process characteristics from the methodology of these individual interventions. Then the next step, which is optional, is if you are looking at a portfolio of different interventions, you can then take the results of these different tools and then assess that through the portfolio tool. And this will give you a synthesis report to be able to compare a set of interventions and also show the alignment with the country's SDG priorities. So we tried to make it simple to determine which tool to actually use. If you're going to evaluate multiple interventions, you would use the portfolio tool. If there's any component of the project or activity that would lead to emissions reductions that would be traded within a market scheme, then you need to use the carbon markets tool. And if the intervention is financed at least in part by sources other than public budgets, then you would use the investment tool. And if your intervention doesn't fall under any of these categories, then you would just use the general tool. So into the actual methodology that we used. This is the framework that is provided by the ICAT Transformational Change methodology. So here you have 2 main categories of transformational impact. There are processes of change. So for example, adoption of certain technologies, scale up of the adoption of technologies, impacting social norms and awareness and behavior. And then there are actual concrete outcomes. So we need to contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation, and also SDGs. And the combination of these 2 leads to transformational impact. So what we did with our tools was take these categories, keep them, but actually define them with guiding questions to be able to tailor these impacts to different project or policy types. So you'll find you have all of these categories within each of the tools, but then there are guiding questions that are specific to carbon markets or private investments, policies, etc. Once you've answered the set of questions based on these guiding questions, you then come to the assessment results. And here we take a combination of the processes of change. So is your intervention very unlikely or very likely to lead to processes of change? and then the actual outcomes. Did you have major or minor impacts on climate and SDGs? And here we also took into account that there could also be negative impacts. So once you fill out all of these questions, you get this heat map here where you can see your intervention. Of course, green would be very transformational, and then red is less likely to be transformational. And you also get a numerical score. And this helps to compare, for example, in the portfolio tool, or if a country is looking at a set of interventions that were assessed with the various tools, the idea is that you should be able to compare the impacts of, for example, a carbon market intervention and a policy that was assessed under the general tool, because it's reflected in the same sort of scoring network here. So on the actual methodology of the tools, we went back and forth a bit, but decided that we should be able to assess both ex ante and ex post assessments. And if you do an ex ante assessment, you can go back and then edit ex post to reflect the actual impact of the activity. The tools operate on self-assessment. This is important to understand. There's no third-party verification. The purpose of the tools is, depending on the user, it could be, for example, to assess, should I go for a certain carbon market activity? Will it really be transformational? Or should I implement a certain policy within my country? Will this lead to transformational change? How transformational is the set of policies that I'm thinking about implementing? It's not meant to necessarily be any kind of certification. So it operates on self-assessment, and this is also to keep it simple and easy to use. But that's also important to understand. Then, as I said, the process and outcome categories are the same in each of the tools to keep them aligned, but the guiding questions are tailored to each of the tool. So, for example, there is the application of unique criteria that underpin carbon market interventions. So, for example, allocating a share of mitigation outcomes to the host country or decreasing baseline emission coefficients over time. These are characteristics that could make an activity more transformational, but wouldn't necessarily be applicable to another policy. Then within the carbon markets tool, the one thing that makes it different from the other tools is that we also added an environmental integrity preconditions section, and I'll go into this a bit more. We also give the user the opportunity to define whether or not these indicators from the previous slide are actually relevant for the intervention. So for example, for a technology which has been around for a while, maybe it's not so relevant to focus on research and development, versus for a new technology, maybe this is particularly important and could really lead to transformational impact. So we give the user the opportunity to develop an assessment which is really tailored to their intervention. We then decided to also use a weighted scoring approach because certain characteristics are much more, I don't want to say important, but important than others. So for example, having large climate impact is of course something that really affects the transformation of the activity. And this scoring is transparent on the generated report. So you can see what the weight of each category was. So as I said, the one thing that separates the carbon market tool from the other tool is that we have this environmental and social integrity preconditions section. And here we felt that carbon markets are a bit more difficult to assess in terms of transformational change, because we have such a crisis of confidence in carbon markets in the moment. And here it's really important to ensure that we're meeting basic criteria before we label an activity transformational. So with other policies and private investments, we didn't find this to be such an important criteria to include, but with carbon markets, we thought that we need to define minimum preconditions that have to be met before the activity can be transformational. And if one of these isn't met, then you can't actually move forward with the assessment. So these could be basic tenets such as additionality or the prevention of negative environmental and social impacts. And we grouped these under 3 headings. So safeguards for environmental integrity, prevention of GHG emissions lock-in, and then the prevention of avoidance of negative environmental and social impacts. And if you meet each of these preconditions, then you move forward to the next section of the tool, and you can actually assess the factors that maybe go above and beyond and would therefore be transformational. Overall, in designing the tool, I think one thing that we struggled with the most was this dance of balancing robustness and user-friendliness, because of course we want to really contribute to transformational change. And in the beginning, I think included maybe too many indicators. And then we ended up doing a case study with some colleagues in Vietnam with concrete project ideas and assessed areas where the tool can be consolidated, or also where there might need to be additional explanation or resources or some guidance on how to actually quantify impacts. And we tried to strike a balance between a tool which is robust but is still user-friendly. So the intervention outcomes, such as GHG, SDG, and adaptation impacts, can be addressed with either qualitative or quantitative indicators. So we felt that in particular for an ex-ante assessment of a policy, for example, you may not have so much quantitative data on the impact. So we enable a qualitative assessment, but then there are other cases. So for example, in carbon markets, you need to have quantitative data to actually go through the validation and verification process. So you have this data, and this of course enables a more robust assessment, and we wanted to enable the user to give that information as well. So here we provided that optionally and gave the guidance on how to actually calculate quantitative impacts. So we left this a bit flexible to hopefully leave it open for as many users as possible. Related to that debate was also the debate of whether or not to make the uploading of documents as evidence required or optional. And here we also decided that especially for a quick ex-ante assessment of a potential activity, if you have to upload evidence for every single item, then that's really going to drag out the process for the user. And we wanted to make this as easy to use as possible. So we give you the option to upload documentation. So you may want to do this, for example, if you're a carbon market project developer and you want to market your activity to a potential buyer as a particularly transformational activity, then you can upload the documentation. And this is indicated on the results sheet. The documentation was provided, and this leads to a more robust assessment. So we tried to make it clear whether or not the user went for a more simplified approach with qualitative answers and a lack of documentation, or if they really went the extra mile to calculate quantitative impacts and then provide that documentation. And this is how we struck this balance, more or less. So I hope you all take a look at the tool, and feel free to also give us your opinion on how it works for you and what type of policies or projects you think it's best suited for. We're certainly looking to continue to refine it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. Well, that was very interesting also, a very different approach. We've now had 3 quite different approaches. I think I look forward to hear also from Francesco, a 4th one, and then we'll have some questions and maybe can compare and contrast. And of course, the speakers are all also most welcome to have questions for each other as well. We'll have some discussion. Thank you, Erin. Can we hand it to you, Francesco? And then after that, we'll move to some discussion.
Thank you so much. I can share my screen. Let me, if you can, sorry, if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, thank you again for the kind invitation to this nice and insightful event. I'm Francesco Tonini from Politecnico di Milano, a technical university in Italy, and I'm working in the Department of Energy under the UNESCO Chair in Energy for Sustainable Development. And within this framework, we developed a tool that for now it is more a pilot than a tool. So maybe my presentation will be a step back with respect to what was presented from the colleagues so far. What I will go to present you today, it is this concept of this framework of analysis that is based on the system dynamics that we use to assess the challenges of sustainable development with, of course, a specific focus on the energy challenges that is our focus as research in our department. The starting point, it is related to the fact that nowadays we are living in an uncertainty period where different dramatic events are coming up and down on a daily basis. And this is generating an additional complexity to the planning phase, either in policy design or in project development and project planning and implementation. So the idea behind the development of this tool, it is to define a methodology for ex-ante impact evaluation that is capable to assist and help in long-term policy design and project planning. In this way, we can basically rely on a set of data that are needed to be properly collected and assessment, either with field campaign or collecting data from the literature or browsing online databases. So using this amount of data, we can adopt the methodology I will show you later on to assess which will be the impact and the outcomes that the project under planning phase it is going to produce in terms of benefits for the target communities. I have to say that so far the tool, the methodology has been piloted for only the local context, but the idea it is then to broaden the perspective and enlarge our focus not only to local communities but also to national countries. Another opportunity that our methodology it is bringing to the table, another aspect of innovation, is that thanks to the same methodology, it is also to perform a ex post analysis in which we are going to do the causal inference analysis in order to identify which are the leverage points that produced major changes accordingly to the initial theory of change that is behind the project planning and project implementing phase. With leverage points, I mean such activities that majorly produce positive impact for the local community, even considering the different co-benefit that arise from the different dimension of the intervention. This is because the approach that is based on the system dynamic theory that my colleague Lilibet already mentioned before. So this general theory, this general framework, it is able to produce instrument in order to assess and define analyze the complexity that is behind the theory of change that we would like to analyze in a local situation in order to make our project intervention as much effective as possible. So thanks to a first qualitative instrument that is based on the adoption of a causal loop diagram that are there to analyze the different feedback loops that are behind the different variable and indicator hidden in a logical framework, perhaps, understanding the mutual link that produce a logic that it is not only monodirectional, but also bidirectional in a complex manner, so that you can identify different interconnection between the different indicators and variables involved in the problem. This is producing a situation in which we can identify also some time delays because, as you perfectly know better than me, when you are producing some outputs, you are running some activities, then it might necessary to wait a certain amount of time before considering tangible outcomes, measuring outcomes in the target beneficiaries. This is producing a time delay which generates nonlinear dynamics, because if some outcomes are coming in with a delay in time, this means that the linearity between cause effects and the effects, it is broken. And again, thanks to the mathematics that is behind a system dynamics model, we can enable to tackle this non-linearity in order to be able to do long-term assessment in an effective way. And how it is possible to do? It is possible to do this by using very simple differential and integral equation that are hidden in the mathematical model we developed. What I mean with differential and integral, it is basically summarized with this graph, where we can see as a differential equation a flow that is accumulated in a stock that is the integral variable. So perhaps it is easier to understand it as a considering an example for GDP, the actual GDP in a country, or the actual average income of a local community, it is the accumulation of the GDP growth rate over time. So the money, it is accumulated in the treasury of a national body, contributing to the actual value of GDP. But in turn, this dynamic, it is driven by the GDP growth rate, that in turn, it can be considered as an accumulated a stock variable, because this is the accumulation of the GDP growth rate change over time, and so on and so forth. So understanding all the complexity that it is behind the different driver of economic growth, social growth, socioeconomic growth in the end, can enable us to map all the variables involved in a problem, and so derive trustful simulation and estimation of the evolution of the system over time. And we can do this, of course, based on the different dimension of the sustainable development. So the same model can be used to assess the economic dimension, the people, the planet, and also other dimensions like peace and partnership. Then the tangible outcome we can derive from the application of the tool, it is an assessment from ex-ante perspective, in this case, on how the project can produce positive changes in the local community with respect to the national average. And to do so, we decided to map those indicators from the Sustainable Development Framework that are able to be quantified either at a national level, looking to international database, World Bank, EIA, EMF, and so on and so forth, and compared to some numbers we can derive from the simulation of our model, understanding the value of the related indicators for the target communities. In this way, we can see how the project outcomes and project impacts react against the national average of the country, and therefore basically the starting point in which the intervention is going to be produced. As I mentioned, this tool, it is still at the pilot phase, and for a matter of reducing the complexity of the study of the analysis, we started by looking to the local context, and we already targeted 2 different development projects that are related to climate mitigation and adaptation policies. The first one, it is related to a renewable microgrid that has been installed and developed in a rural context of Tanzania, where we assessed the co-benefit that are generated by the access to electricity in the community, together with other complementary activities that are meant to foster the socioeconomic development of the village, based on the push for new income generating activity that can be fueled by the new electricity generated. And the other project, it is related to a plastic collection campaign in Bali, Indonesia, where again the target community was local fishermen, so local communities, and the assessment was made again to see the co-benefit that are rose by the additional income this community of fishermen can gain from the activity of plastic collection. And in this case, another bricks that I bring to the discussion, it is also related to the social the perspective analysis based on understanding which is the perspective, how can I say, the feeling of the target community related to the produced change and benefit for the environment and the broader community of local cities and local villages. And with this, I thank you a lot for the discussion, and I'm open again to the question.
Very good, interesting as well. Well, both the first Lilibeth and last speaker used similar methodologies, but implemented quite differently. And then two quite different methodologies from Daniel and Aaron as well. Now, we don't have that much time for questions, so I had been given some pre-cooked questions by Derja, but I would prefer to see if the audience has questions, or indeed whether the speakers have questions to each other. And in the meantime, somebody is getting ready to do a poll as well, as you could quickly see there. But first, maybe, can I ask if somebody in the audience here in the room has questions, or if somebody online has questions, who is monitoring the chat? There are no questions so far. Who in the room has questions? Don't be shy, go ahead.
I have a question.
Go ahead. I was looking at.
So, yes, I invited Francisco to speak today because I found out about this methodology through an unusual way, but through a colleague of Francesco, Tommaso. And Francesco is the focal point for this methodology. And when Francesco explained the methodology to me, he mentioned a lot about the theory of change. And I'm more of a project person rather than, I guess, a scientific or academic person. But that really, sparked my interest, and my ears pricked up. I'm like, okay, theory of change. You're speaking my language here, right? So my question to Francesco is, what is the potential for this methodology to be scaled up to policy impact assessments when we look at the theory of change of a policy, of an intended policy?
Francesco, was the question clear?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anna, and also thank you for the invitation. Yes, as I mentioned, the reason why we decided to go for a pilot phase targeted in local context, it is only, forgive me about this, for a matter of reduce the complexity, because addressing the local context, it is easier for us to touch by hand the theory of change, addressing real problems with real people in the local community. But let's say the framework, it is meant to be scaled up at national level. So this process it should be straightforward, simply addressing the complexity that is coming with a higher level of concurrency of causes that is coming if we look to a problem, to a theory of change seen from the national level. So in this way, we will address more challenges related to the mapping of all the variables involved in the system. We will need to address all the linkages between the different dimensions of the sustainable development that in a country are coming all together at the same time. But provided that we can scale up the same methodology and the prerequisites are there, I think the same approach can produce very positive result also at that level of discussion.
Thank you. I would like to ask then a follow-up question to Lilibeth, because indeed I know, Francesco was showed more of the detail of his equations and so on, but I've seen many of Lilibeth's reports on the GGI simulation tool as well. Could you comment a little bit on comparing, contrasting what Francesco showed and your own process and where they differ or where they align in your view?
Yes, thank you very much, Frank, for that question. Yeah, so I think what Francesco has shown is very interesting, very scientific aligned, if you like. I think what we are doing at GCSIM, a bit different is actually when we look for the models, we don't start with the theory of change, because we know for different systems there are already lots of models out there, validated models, so we do not have to start from scratch. So that means we have to leverage from this knowledge already generated. But of course, we still have to add knowledge from our side. So what we are doing is, after checking that some parts of a model, parts of a tool are relevant for SDGs, we take them, but we try to see how they interlink. That's actually the how would I say, the science, or if you like, the art for this GGSIM. Because only if you were able to find out where they can be interlinked, then you will be able to compute this SDG co-benefits. So, yeah.
Francesco, have you had a chance to see anything on GGSIM, the tools that Lilibeth and team have developed?
Yes, I was looking at it also during the Lilibeth discussion, and I would like to bring on the table also another work that is done from other colleagues in the Millennium Institute. I don't know if you ever get in touch with them, but I think also that work, it is very highly aligned with the GGSIM tool, addressing again the national scale. And let's say that also our work, it was inspired by them. So this is also the reason why I see the potential for the scale up, as I told you, because there is this benchmark that we all have in their work.
Yeah, M21, the Millennium Institute's tool, yes.
Thank you very much, but I think it's very timely because on October 4, we have the final review of our report. And on that also, we already created our international expert group for the GGSIM. So we are starting to invite, like with the index, we have international expert group. We're starting to invite also, or we have already invited, we have 20 now in our group, and we will of course invite more, because we want to have the credibility and more knowledge coming into the GGSIM. Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. I mean, those are indeed interesting approaches around system dynamics. Daniel and Aaron, you had quite different approaches. Daniel showed us a very large database looking at actual observed changes in the break-in emissions. I was curious if you have already observed, if you like, use of your methodology, or if you can easily imagine how your methodology could be used in practice. Could you comment on that possibly?
Yeah, Frank, many thanks for the question. So So the quick answer is we don't have any experience on that, but I mean, indeed, that is something that is on the table for us. I mean, what we are planning to do is, I mean, the data that the study relies on goes only until 2022. So we are collecting now data for the next years. We are also expanding the geographical scope. So the idea is really to convert that methodology into a living assessment tool. You know, that we can, once we have more countries or more years, that we can essentially replicate what has been done by the Potsdam Institute colleagues to get new and updated insights.
Interesting.
The way is underway, so work is underway, so probably we should probably have something in the middle of next year, middle to end next year.
Yeah, very interesting. Aaron, allow me, I think you almost come from the opposite end. You know, you designed together with your colleagues a very practical tool to give immediate use to practitioners. But in a way, from what I understood, it's a little bit more black box, right? You come up with practical questions and then you get the heat map. I'm not entirely sure what was in your methodologies. Maybe you can say a little bit more how you generate the link from you know, the user input to then judging which is the more likely policy that has a higher transformational value or not. Could you comment a bit more on what's inside the box, so to speak?
Sure, yes, absolutely. And I think if you take a look at the tool and especially the assessment reports, then it becomes much clearer. But you know, with 15 minutes, not so much time to go into all the details. But I showed you this diagram, I guess, of the different topics of transformational change. So agents, technologies, etc. These were the topics that came out of the methodology, and we then wanted to operationalize this. So for example, with the greenhouse gas outcomes, that falls under the outcomes of change. There, of course, the concrete question is, you know, what is the scale of the emissions reductions generated from your activity on a local, on a subnational, and on a national level? And then we give the user a set of options. So we have the qualitative assessment, where, yeah, if you don't know the exact scale of your emissions, then you can enter something qualitative based on what you believe the impact to be. And then we also give the guidance on how to do a quantitative assessment. So here we've also auto-filled the data as much as possible to try and make it as easy as possible on the user. But on a local scale, we may give, okay, what are the local emissions from this sector? And then you can input what your reduction of emissions would be to then quantify the impact of your assessment. And for carbon markets, of course, as I said, we also have these specific indicators for carbon markets. So if you want to have incentives for change, then you have things like contributing a certain amount of mitigation outcomes to the host country, or reducing the baseline even below what's required by the standard, etc. So we tried to really tailor this, and you see this as well in the general and investment tools. But I actually have another question for the other panelists, because in operationalizing this methodology, the thing that we struggled with the most was actually the SDG outcomes. Because of course we know from a lot of activities, and we had a particular focus on carbon markets as this was our tool, but even in carbon markets where you have to quantify your impact on the SDGs, it's really difficult because you have to define a baseline. If you want to know what your impact is, you need to know what the current situation is. And especially for SDGs that are related to gender or some of these more abstract concepts, we know that there's an issue, but how do you quantify this issue? So I'm curious to the other panelists, or even anyone in the audience, if anyone has any innovative approaches to assessing change on these more nebulous topics. I would love to hear your input.
Thank you, Erin. I think that's a good question for Lilibeth. I know she's been working on that for years, but of course the other panel members, if you want to comment on that, that'd be cool too. Erin? Oh, sorry, Lilibeth?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Erin. Yeah. So yeah, I really appreciate that question because this is really the part of the GGC where we have been investing lots of time in the past year. Yeah, so as I said already, there is no systematic models. we scratch everything, all the models, we read literature to check really how are we going to implement this in system dynamics model. It's very difficult because we cannot, because even if there's system dynamic models, if there's a data missing, you cannot run it anymore. So what we're doing now is that from this conceptual model, we apply the AI. So the AI is trying to imitate what should be this model, two parts. So first, checking how the data, if we reconstruct it. So you can, through machine learning, you can somehow teach your data, how it will look like. It's like a magic, but I think that's what AI is all about. So that's why the part where I think AI is very, very useful is to close the data gaps, because it will be very difficult to collect data for social inclusion and gender even in the future. And so I think we have been trying to train, doing machine learning, running that several, thousands of times until that a model knows how to adjust that and follow the trend. So we use global data as well for that, for training, because if one country has a missing data, you cannot really compare, right? So we're training it against the other countries' data and see how that converge. And so when we have created this data, then we were able to do that, to put that. That's one step. Another step is to look for proxy variables. And then we check again these proxy variables. How good is proxy variables fitting into the model? And then we use again AI on that, feature selection. And so there are different approaches for AI when you can really check the data, your model, until you find a solution that you say you can use your model for gender inclusion. I will be very happy to discuss with you a bit more because this is very technical.
Indeed, I think the whole subject lends itself for ample follow-up discussion. I was going to give maybe any of the speakers a chance if you have any key questions or things you want to bring up or ask each other, and finally then give Derece a chance to say.
Maybe she has one question.
You have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, if the time allows. Hi everyone, this is Carly. I'm from Hong Kong. I just landed yesterday to attend this conference. So I'm kind of an educator, advocate for climate change. I think Aaron just echoed with my questions on assessing the impacts of system change about well-being and gender on other SDG. But one thing about is, another question is that I come from Hong Kong as a city, and sometimes as a city, we have our own climate action plan. So how we can assess it better and authorize these mechanisms into our own city so that it can align with the country's NDCs, for example.
Yes, I think the question on subnational versus national policies. Any of our panelists would like to say something about that? I know that it's about time, that's why this is the last question. So I think you asked a very difficult question. And I don't see any volunteers for this. So I think we're going to have to do some after the session.
I have an answer for you. Let's talk later.
Yeah, Lilibeth is happy to talk about that. So, or Daniel, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I mean, in principle, the key challenge is, of course, that we face the same problem with very small OECD countries. No, I mean, if you think, for example, we have Luxembourg, which is probably even smaller in terms of population than Hong Kong. And we can still apply kind of the same methodologies that we do have for Luxembourg. The big problem is, of course, data availability. I guess for Hong Kong, you probably do have a lot of data, in particular, if you're also interested in SDGs, then you certainly do have a lot of data on that front. Yeah, so to that extent, you can actually apply the same methodologies. And let me also say just one thing. What I was presenting today is essentially only looking at greenhouse gas emissions. So if you want to look into SDGs, you can essentially also apply the same methodology and look into any indicator of SDGs that you want and see which policies have been actually effective in really reducing poverty or strengthening energy access and so on and so forth. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that effort and the questions. We do have to wrap up, I think, because we have other sessions as well. So let me then just say the last few words. I thought it was very interesting. It's a very complex topic, as I think all speakers demonstrated, with quite different approaches. For us, this is not the end. I mean, from DJI side, we're going to work on this more in 2025. And I think we see some real opportunities to work together with OECD, for instance, to expand the number of countries to work in. We see some opportunities potentially, I think, between these different system dynamics approaches that were shown here today as well. So I hope you found it interesting. I certainly did. And on our side, Derja and Maria Paula are continuing to work, and we'll look forward to continue to liaise with these possible partners. And I hope that, in a year from now or so, we can answer a few more questions and possibly have a few more practical tools. Although I think Erin would say that her toolkit is already pretty ready for use. I think that's probably the closest to a tool that could be used tomorrow if you have an immediate client, if you like, who wants to approach a problem. But on the other hand, I think I'd love to see a little bit more quantitative impacts estimated, which will take a little bit more time. So I think there are tools already if you want to have answers tomorrow. And there are some pretty interesting methodologies that I think each of the people speaking here today will be continuing to work on. And I hope that for DJI, we can see some good partnerships to take this forward. So can we thank all the speakers?